Hello, and welcome to alkanes, the simplest type of organic molecule in this course. All they are is a chain of carbon atoms with no double bonds and no other elements except hydrogen. As a result, the formula for the number of hydrogen atoms in a standard alkane is 2n plus 2, where n is the number of carbon atoms. For cycloalkanes, the formula is 2n, as the molecule requires another carbon-carbon bond, which replaces the two extra carbon-hydrogen bonds we'd usually have. As just mentioned, a defining characteristic of an alkane is the lack of double bonds. The word we use to describe a molecule without double bonds is saturated. The test for whether an organic molecule is saturated involves bromine water and will be covered in our next video, which is about alkenes. But how do we get an alkane in the first place? Great question, discerning and insightful viewer. There are 3 ways you need to know about. The first way is cracking. Cracking is when we break longer chains of hydrocarbons into shorter ones. Why? Because longer chain hydrocarbons have much higher boiling points and take far greater effort for us to combust. They aren't nearly as useful as shorter chain hydrocarbons as a result. The second way is fractional distillation. Fractional distillation is a process that allows us to separate different hydrocarbons from the mixture we call crude oil. We do this by evaporating a lot of the oil and then having collection points at various intervals up the collection tube. The tube gets cooler as the evaporated molecules ascend, meaning that those with the lowest boiling points and therefore shortest carbon chains collect at the top, while those with the very highest boiling points remain as liquids and run out from the bottom. As a result, we manage to separate a crazy mixture of all sorts of different molecules into exactly the types of thing we may want to use them for, as labelled on this diagram I quickly sketched. The third and final way to get an alkane is from another alkane, and we call this reformation. The key thing to note here is that reformation gives us a cycloalkane from a straight chain alkane, which means we have one more carbon-carbon bond, meaning that 2 hydrogens need to break off from the alkane so that it can become a cycloalkane. So, we care about shorter chain alkanes because they're the most useful for releasing energy from combustion. But what does that combustion look like? Here are the complete and incomplete combustions of ethane. Let's take a look at the products of these combustions and what problems they create. For complete combustion, it's not so bad. Water is completely harmless, and carbon dioxide, while poisonous and partially responsible for climate change, is not nearly as bad as a few other products incomplete combustion can form. Let's check those out. Again, water is harmless, but carbon? Carbon is actually a solid at these temperatures. A fine black powder that we call soot that can get almost anywhere. Soot can clog the pipes in the car's engine, or even crawl into your lungs. But you know what's even worse to get in your lungs? Carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is so poisonous that it makes carbon dioxide look fluffy by comparison. It rips oxygen out of the red blood cells in your blood, replaces the oxygen with itself, and will never detach from those cells again until you get treatment from a hospital, potentially suffocating you long before that point. So, from these reactions, we know about the harmfulness of carbon dioxide, soot, and carbon monoxide. But there are 2 more harmful products of combustion that you need to be aware of: sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide. Sulfur is a common and unwanted impurity in crude oil and coal. When heated with oxygen, often accidentally, it forms sulfur dioxide. Nitrogen is different. Nitrogen is not an impurity in crude oil, but nitrogen and oxygen are ever present in the air. They just need to reach a high enough temperature to react. Temperatures like the insides of a car's engine, which allow for the formation of nitrogen dioxide. But why are sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide really bad? Simple. When they get into the clouds, they react with water vapor and create the terrible phenomenon that we call acid rain. I don't think I need to explain why acid rain isn't exactly pleasant for humans or the environment. So, what can be done to greatly limit the amount of these harmful products that we release out into the world? The answer is a catalytic converter. One side rips the oxygen atoms off of nitrogen oxides to release N2 and O2, while the other oxidizes the carbon monoxide molecules to make them into carbon dioxide molecules. Unfortunately, because these things require a small amount of platinum, palladium, and rubidium as catalysts, they are often stolen, and we will run out of the platinum needed to create them in the near future. But let's get back to the brighter sides of things again, and talk about alternative fuels, the ones we can create by processing waste vegetable oil, like biodiesel. Biodiesel is super biodegradable and completely non-toxic. Moreover, it's carbon neutral, meaning it doesn't release any CO2. Sadly, the processes to create biodiesel still require energy, likely produced from fossil fuels, but that is far better than can be said of any fossil fuels themselves. If you would like, please pause the video to ensure you memorize or note down the advantages and disadvantages of biofuels listed here. The last three specification points of this part of the organics topic introduce a new idea: radicals. Radicals are formed when a bond breaks in such a way that instead of one atom receiving both electrons, each atom receives only one electron. We call this homolytic fission, because homo means the same, and both atoms receive the same number of electrons, 1. These atoms are now radicals, species with an unpaired electron. We annotate this by adding a dot next to that species. Radicals are important at A level due to the fact that chlorine molecules break down into a pair of chlorine radicals when exposed to UV light. But why is that in the alkane video? Well, because these radicals can then react with alkanes in what is known as a radical substitution reaction. This reaction has 3 steps. The first step is initiation, exactly what I have already shown. UV light breaks a chlorine-chlorine bond through homolytic fission, and each chlorine atom receives only 1 electron. The second step is propagation. When writing the propagation step of a radical substitution mechanism, the first part is showing how the chlorine radical reacts with the alkane. In this case, the chlorine radical lends the methane molecule its unpaired electron, making the methane molecule the radical, and then that methane molecule loses one of its hydrogens as a result. This leaves us with a CH3 radical. The second part of writing a propagation step is showing that we can reform the radical we started with, the chlorine radical, because that demonstrates that this is a chain reaction. In this case, that means that we have the CH3 radical reacting with a chlorine molecule to form CH3Cl and that all-important chlorine radical. But then, if this is meant to be a chain reaction, what stops it? Let's look at the termination step. Termination is the final step of radical substitution mechanisms, and it is how we show that this ends. The way any sort of radical mechanism ends is by getting rid of all the radicals. That happens when 2 radicals react, because the unpaired electrons become a pair again. So, for this reaction, we have each of the radicals reacting with each other. two chlorine radicals reacting with each other, a CH3 radical reacting with a chlorine radical, and two CH3 radicals reacting with each other. However, even with all of this in mind, the overall reaction here does not give us a full picture of everything that's happening. The main factor that makes these reactions slightly less useful in the real world is that they can form side products. For example, the aforementioned ethane. But here's the interesting thing. That ethane can react even further if another radical comes into contact with it, because then it will become a C3H7 radical. And then that C3H7 radical could react with another CH3 radical and become C4H10. And that C4H10 could then react with another radical and become an even larger molecule when it needs to be terminated by another CH3 radical, and so on, potentially forever, with each step being significantly less likely than the one before. All you need to know is that that can happen, and that's why these reactions become less practical. And that's the end of alkanes. Our next video covers alkenes. See you there.